I'm Murat Çelikkan. I'm the co-director of Hafıza Merkezi. As Hafıza Merkezi, we're organizing a series of panel discussions to have a comparative approach to the rising authoritarianism and the struggle against it. The panels are organized by a joint project of Hafıza Merkezi with the Association for Monitoring Equal Rights, Turkey, and Dutch Helsinki. As you might be well aware of, civil society is currently under a threat in many parts of the world. The 21st century introduced many nations abandoning human rights, institutions, and standards which they previously supported. This era has been identified as the shrinking civil or democratic space. Making a situation worse, the emergence of COVID-19 as a global pandemic created new risks and challenges for rights-based work as a whole. We are holding a series of online panels where we get the chance to discuss human rights work comparatively under COVID-19 conditions, particularly within the framework of shrinking civil space. We wanted to start from a conceptual base to take a picture of activism under shrinking civil space in the first panel. This session will present an overview of the issues and concepts surrounding the notion of shrinking civil space, its evolving new shapes, particularly in the context of the pandemic, as well as a discussion on the new tactics currently being employed as a response. Our second panel will be on the 5th of November. It will be about digital rights, and Nikat Dad from Pakistan and Kerem Altıparmak from Turkey will participate on that second panel. Maybe this attempt of discussing shrinking space or rising authoritarianism in a series of comparative discussions online can also be named as citizen diplomacy. The name father for it is the Venezuelan NGO Provia. This example comes from the wonderful book about shrinking civil space, Rising to the Populist Challenge by Cesar-Rodrigues Garavito and Krishna Gomez. I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Cesar-Rodrigues Garavito, who is the co-director, Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, New York University School of Law, and editor-in-chief of Open Global Rights. He is also the founder of Just Labs. He has been a visiting professor at New York University, Stanford University, Brown University, the University of Melbourne, Pretoria in South Africa, and the European University Institute, and the American University in Cairo. It's not our first collaboration with Cesar, and I'm very happy that we keep coming together. The name of the first panel is Reopening Civic Spaces for Civil Society in Times of COVID-19. Shrinking civil spaces may be the most popular concept of civil rights organizations all around the world recently. And Cesar, I would like to address my first question to you, saying that in your book, you state that the proliferation of populist governments and movements creates serious risks and challenges for human rights around the world, from India to Venezuela, from the United States to Turkey, from Hungary to Russia, and from the Philippines to Poland. What is this concept of shrinking civil space, and what are the common characteristics of it?
Thank you, Murat. Let me begin by saying that it is indeed an honor for me to be in this event. and share this space with Murad and Hafıza Merkezi and the Dutch Helsinki Committee, who are all at the front lines of both the analysis and the struggle against illiberal democracies and against shrinking civil society spaces. It is because of these organizations and many others in countries like the ones that Murad nicely mentioned that human rights continue to be thriving, at least as a promise for human dignity around the world, and I'm honored to be here with you all. In terms of the concept, I would start by saying that the most challenging aspect of the current wave of restrictions against civil society, including NGOs that work for human rights, independent media outlets, and so on, academic institutions, and so on, is that it's coming most of the time from governments who were initially elected through democratic processes. So these are not the authoritarians of the late 20th century, right? The human rights movement originated in my own corner of the world in Latin America in opposition to dictatorships, or military dictatorships that arose in the 1970s and that met with the resistance of, say, the relatives of the quote-unquote disappeared by the Southern Cone's military juntas in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and so on. As horrible as those human rights violations were, and as authoritarian as those governments were, the game plan was relatively clear for human rights organizations. These were unelected governments that could be delegitimized internationally precisely because they had not come to power through democratic elections. Now, that playbook, and this is the term that we use in the book, that playbook of human rights activists got more and more sophisticated, more impactful over the last 50 years, finds real obstacles and gets into trouble when it comes to facing off against leaders in countries around the world who came to office through democratic means only to then go on to dismantle democratic guarantees. And this is where the new playbook of authoritarian elected governments come in, because they tend to be quite adept at using the law to do away with democratic law. And one perfect example is Hungary. Viktor Orban, for over a decade, has very patiently chipped away at the institutions of democratic governance. Back in the 1990s, the Hungarian Constitutional Court was a model. Actually, it was quoted as a particularly independent, sophisticated, innovative in constitutional court. Now, he packed the court, then went on to use the electoral laws to make sure that the rules were changed to persecute their opponents, to the point that even that today, Hungary, even by mainstream standards, like think tanks who lean to the conservative side of politics, today have declared that Hungary is no longer a democracy. And likewise, one can go one country after another. Of course, there are perfect examples in Turkey, in more recently in India, Venezuela, and this is another trait. This cuts across the conventional political divisions. So it's not an issue, it's not a threat or a challenge coming only from right-wing governments or from left-wing governments. But look at what happens, for example, in Venezuela. It's a country that has gone through a particularly painful period where Provea, the organization that Murad quoted, has done a tremendously courageous job at defending what's left of democratic institutions there, if anything. And so the challenge, to sum up, is particularly difficult and has led to innovations on the part of human rights organizations and civil society organizations, media outlets, religious organizations, independent collectives of youth, and so on, because the tools of yesterday, for example, trying to shame, the activists and scholars used to call the main strategy of the human rights movement naming and shaming, meaning denouncing authoritarian leaders before the UN institutions or European or North American governments, and hoping that those governments and those institutions would put pressure on those authoritarian leaders to do the right thing and protect human rights. Well, as we know, they're not getting receptive ears in Washington or even the EU, and this calls for a different set of approaches, which in the book that Murat mentioned, we propose by way of a new playbook for human rights activists around the world.
Okay. Before I would directly ask about the new way of activism against this shrinking civil space, but before that, let me just check out that there are claims that it's not shrinking space, but it's being reshaped on the one hand. One claim is that, and the other is, to give an example, Catherine Sicking puts out, in fact, the human rights situation in the world is not deteriorating, but in a global sense, it's improving when you look at the data of environmental movements and women's movements. You also mentioned the tension between democracy and human rights because of the elected leaders. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that too? Thank you, Cesar.
Sure. So on the first part of the question, I agree with Catherine Sicking that this is not the end times of human rights. There are some skeptical scholars, mostly in the US and some parts of Europe, that have concluded that because of the challenge of authoritarian leaders, like the ones that we'll be talking about today, and because of also the twin challenges of other sources of human rights abuses that I understand you will be talking about in this series soon. For example, the dominance of digital platforms and around the world, and the fact that they're being used to polarize the national polities and turn people into tribal members that are further apart. Because of all of that, some scholars have concluded that these are the end times of human rights, that human rights had a good run, but that was a project for the 20th century. And now in the 21st century, they've gone into a period of terminal crisis, and we need to come up with a different project. I do not agree with those criticisms, while accepting, and I've tried to strike kind of an intermediate tone in this discussion. I think that while they are not right, that this is a terminal crisis of human rights, I also think that human rights will not continue to be impactful, useful, if new tactics are not attempted, if the whole toolbox of human rights activism is not rethought, because again, populist authoritarian leaders are very happy to be named, but are shameless, right? So naming and shaming doesn't work as it used to, because they're very happy, all these authoritarian types of usually men with huge egos and immensely narcissistic tendencies. They cannot have enough of themselves and so they're happy to be named, but they are shameless. So naming and shaming just won't do it. Now, that doesn't mean that human rights have not made incredible contributions to the protection and improvement of protection of human dignity around the world. And Catherine Sicking, in that book and in a wonderful book entitled Evidence for Hope, shows empirical data about how, for instance, women's rights or civil and political rights around the world have improved relative to, say, the 1970s. Now, what we need to focus on, and this is my own take on these issues, is that we need to acknowledge the progress that has been made, but we cannot basically sit idle and think that those tools that got us there will be enough to sustain that progress, let alone to make additional progress. And this is where the knowing the target governments, knowing how they operate, and knowing their nature is important. So I'll close my answer by tackling the second part of the question that Murad raised, which is, well, something that's particularly challenging with regards to these illiberal democratic governments. There are many ways to call these governments, and different authors have different ways of calling them. For instance, Viktor Orban himself once said that he wanted to build an illiberal democratic government in Hungary. Some other people call them populist authoritarianism. So we won't get bogged down into the terminological discussion, but there are two characteristics that I think all of these governments, left and right, share. One is strong anti-elitism, and this is why some of them are called populist, but that's a misleading characterization if not qualified with other terms. But the crucial aspect is that the trick that many of these governments pull is that they are oftentimes led by the elites themselves. So look at what happens, for instance, in India these days, which is the most recent and painful example of the succession of measures that have been tried elsewhere, policies, judicial persecutions, sending prominent activists to jail, and I don't have to explain how painful this is to this audience. And this is happening as we speak in India. And no one is looking at what's going on there because we're all distracted, of course, with the pandemic and with what's going on in the US and so on. But India, the largest democracy in the world, is adopting the last pieces that was missing from that playbook. A couple of weeks ago, the Modi government adopted a even more restrictive legislation about foreign funding for independent civil society organizations. It's already co-opted all the media. It has, as you may know, viciously gone against a minority of the population, a huge minority in terms of numbers, which is the Muslim population. All of that with the discourse of working for the working class and going against the elites. Well, it's the elites actually who are trampling the rights of the minorities here. And likewise, and I'm sure that just the description, the brief, very cursory description that I just made will resonate with many in this audience, because you will have recognized that your own countries have gone through exactly the same path of restrictions and unconstitutional measures and measures against civic freedoms. Now, the second and final trait, so we have anti-elitism. So if you see, for example, even President Trump, although he comes clearly from an elite background, he always puts his own fights in terms of fighting against, even today, Washington, as if he were not at the core of Washington, not running Washington. But likewise, second trait is anti-pluralism, which is to be kind of the defining, the crucial characteristic. Because you can be anti-elitist and be democratic and pluralist. And this is what's characterized, for instance, progressive politics in many countries throughout the years, right? So the labor movement, the women's rights movement, so they maybe the racial justice movement. It's all against people or denouncing those sectors of society that have dominated a country or a state forever. Now, but they are not necessarily anti-pluralist. They can coexist with other sectors of society, with other movements. Authoritarian leaders of the 21st century are highly anti-pluralist, meaning that they see themselves and they call themselves a very personalistic type of leadership, that they call themselves the representatives of the real people, while everyone else is working on behalf of foreigners, is part of an intolerant religious group, and so on, or an ethnically stigmatized group like in the Roma in Hungary, and so on. So it's this radical intolerance against anyone but themselves and the groups that they favor, be them religious groups, political groups, economic groups, that define the restrictions and the politics of 21st century autocrats, as Provea de Venezuela organizations has also called them.
Okay, I managed to turn on my voice. Of course, I can have a lot of questions about those common features of the authoritarian or regimes or illiberal democracies or regimes, but I would, before we go to the impact of COVID on this illiberal world, I would also like to ask you about what sort of new tactics can the civil movement have against this anti-elitist, anti-pluralist, illiberal, authoritarian regimes in general?
It's a key question, and one that I try to work on with a number of colleagues in different parts of the world. There is, by the way, a recent series in the portal that I have the privilege of directing. The portal, the web portal, is called Open Global Rights, openglobalrights.org, in which scholars and practitioners from different parts of the world have continued to write about their own initiatives to push back against these types of governments. I'll mention some quickly, and you'll find case studies and opinion pieces there. One is the realization that there needs to be a combination of institutional action and direct action. Human rights organizations around the world, and certainly in spaces that are shrinking, like in India again, or Turkey, or the other countries that we discussed today, for good reasons have been very sophisticated at and invested a lot of resources and knowledge into doing litigation, into proposing new laws, into intervening in the public debate to protect rule of law institutions and mechanisms. So that's more institution-oriented, institution-based work. We have been less energetic and less used to connecting with grassroots mobilization and even disorderly direct action types of strategies, like street protests, rallies, boycotts, international actions that are crowdsourced very quickly, actions put together by non-professionals, all the way from artist collectives to young people, like the organizations and the collectives mobilizing against climate inaction around the world. That has started to change, and I'm very encouraged by that development. Again, in Venezuela, despite all the difficulties, organizations at some junctures during the long struggle against the authoritarian government there have come together with young people protesting on the streets to try to combine what some authors call collective action, which is the institution-based, institutionally oriented type of action on the one hand, and connective with a double N action, connective action, which is the more decentralized online type of mobilization that youth collectives and flash mobs and other forms of 21st century mobilization are able to pull off. Then second, and there's a lot more, but there are some tactics that authoritarian leaders are quite vulnerable to. One is disruptive narratives. So one front in which they have been quite effective is reframing the national conversation, right? So from, say, a conversation about economic injustice in our countries and everywhere these days, almost everywhere, is witnessing this rising levels of inequality, even before COVID, but certainly during the pandemic. But they've been those leaders have been able to reframe that conversation and put the national debate in terms of us versus them, right? The Hindu versus the Muslim versus the secular, the urban populations versus the rural populations, the citizens versus the foreigners, and so on. And they have succeeded to a large extent in polarizing society. So what many organizations are doing very successfully is pushing back against those narratives through narratives that strengthen connections, that highlight community, that find common ground, that even are unpredictable. Some of them, for example, use humor because there's nothing that an authoritarian hates more than humor. They don't have sense of humor, right? So because humor makes people look vulnerable, and these leaders are strong men, and their whole facade depends on them looking powerful and invulnerable. And what humor does is crack that facade. And for example, there's an excellent organization in Europe called Operation Libero that has successfully led campaigns against xenophobic new legislation against foreigners. And they've done that based on new narratives that redefine what it means to be Swiss or German or French in terms of inclusiveness and in terms and using colorful messages and even funny narratives that have been quite effective at pushing back against those discourses.
Since we're talking about an international illiberalism of these leaders, do you think that for civil society actors and other actors, solidarity, national and international solidarity, is important also for going against these regimes?
That's crucial. I couldn't agree more. And some of that is already happening. Of course, some key organizations done a fantastic job, from the frontline defenders to the Helsinki Committees to many organizations that have a long tradition of international solidarity. So that is crucial. Emergency relocation and all that has had an important place in over the last few years for sad reasons, because people have had to leave their countries or have needed support in staying in their own countries by staying free from pressure or persecution. Now, I am particularly encouraged by the fact that there seems to be more cross-learning across regions and countries where exchanges didn't used to be that frequent or common, right? For example, I see more interest these days, for example, in Turkey about what's going on in India, or in Brazil, which is a country that we haven't talked about, but that I care deeply about. I've worked in Brazil for a number of years now. I have very dear friends and colleagues, and Brazil is going through hell, literally through a situation of extreme authoritarianism combined with a wholesale onslaught against the essential ecosystems like the Amazon. So when Brazilian colleagues and Brazilian scholars and activists look around the world, I see that these days they're looking and connecting more often with organizations like Hafıza Merkezi or the National Foundation for India and similar organizations that in contexts that are going through similar situations. I do think that those seeds of exchanges of solidarity will continue to grow, and that because authoritarian democracy will not be there forever, that those will be the seeds of a counter movement and a counter manual against these regimes.
Okay, thank you. As if it was not enough to have the rise of populism and authoritarianism in general, we had the global pandemic. Do you think that it has also an impact, the fight against the pandemic has also an impact on the shrinking civil space?
Yes, I think it does have an impact. It's not a predictable impact because the record is mixed. So some authoritarian leaders and governments have done better than others, whereas others have done a disastrous job. So from Belarus to Brazil. Now, what these situations have in common, and this we know from historical sociology, is that in situations like the one we're going through, basically the largest economic depression after the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s, that new ideas and new institutions and new discourses have a better chance of sticking under these circumstances because the old consensus is disrupted. So if these leaders seemed so resilient and almost indestructible before the pandemic, well, they now seem less so. But it's not a given that without civil society mobilization, without international solidarity, the outcome will be what one would hope for in terms of the renewal and revitalization of democracy and human rights. But I certainly think just as it is a huge challenge for everyone around the world, especially for those living under these types of regimes, it is also an opportunity, and the opportunities for disrupting and hopefully shaking the ground on which these regimes have stood for a number of years now, that will be also an opportunity that will be seized by the human rights movement and by independent civil society organizations.
One of the main common features of these regimes is, let me say, arbitrariness. You can't be sure about the future. What's going to happen? How will it happen? When will it happen? But the fight against such a pandemic needs more precise policies. And is there a tension between the autocratic regimes and the fight against COVID? And is there hope that this pandemic might bring some political changes in the world?
I think so. It is true that these types of governments are highly arbitrary, highly personalistic. So they survive thanks to clientelism because they need to cater to a certain clientele, to a certain sector of society that they define arbitrarily as the real citizens, to the exclusion of everyone else. Now, clientelistic networks are not exactly skillful or prepared to deal with systemic threats like a pandemic, because in order to deal with a systemic threat like the coronavirus, you need a competent bureaucracy, And if you populated that bureaucracy with friends, with sectors of society that you want to do political favors to, well, that's why in political sociology there's such a thing as a clientelistic state, meaning one that's made up of patchwork of cliques, of circles of insiders that are in the exact opposite to a competent bureaucracy that can, for example, safely distribute a vaccine, or that can safely roll out a massive testing system. And this is why many of these governments have had to double down on repressive measures, because they're completely incompetent in dealing with the daily suffering of the populations that they're supposed to serve.
The measures, we know that the measures against the pandemic are taken and kept consistent, even to repress the focal groups in a society. Do you think that the fight against the epidemic and the times we're in created new forms of solidarity and resistance for the civil space to enlarge?
I think so, and this is something that's very encouraging. I think that we're living through a moment that's a combination of the 1930s and the 1960s, at which were the two key turning points in terms of international national institutions in many contexts. So out of the 1930s, got the welfare state in many countries, or at least a developmental state in other countries like Turkey, and depending on the level of development, depending on the historical trajectory, the outcome would be different, but definitely turning points. And at the level of the international governance structure, that was the time when the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, and all the other major institutions that we know of were established. And then the 1970s, with the economic crisis of the early 1970s, was the turning point in the opposite direction. And the pendulum swung in the opposite direction, and then neoliberalism became the dominant framework. I think that, well, it's been widely documented that neoliberalism was already on shaky ground around the world. Inequality had been increasing, and all-out programs of privatization, like the ones that were conducted in some of the countries that we know well, ended up not delivering. And what happened is what could have been anticipated, which is that that level of investment on large, luxurious infrastructure projects, that debt would be recouped at some point by lenders, and that governments would go and countries would go into serious economic trouble. But that was even before the pandemic. Now with the pandemic, those stress points have become more acute. And what's encouraging, despite all the suffering, and no one wants a pandemic, no one would want the situation to be the dominant mode of living anywhere in the world. But now that we're going through a global crisis, there are also opportunities at creating links among movements and among forms of organization that would have been very difficult just a year ago. Let me give you a specific example. Just a year ago, there was a divide between the labor movement and the climate action movement in many countries, because, say, workers in the extractive industries in oil and coal would oppose climate action on the grounds that that would mean the end to their jobs. Well, now those two movements are coming together because the economic crisis has made very visible that oil and gas and those extractive industries were not viable in the first place, and that they would be around for a few more years or decades if the corporations that benefit from those industries continue to lobby parliaments and governments to try to buy time. But now it's clear that a type of Green New Deal is necessary across the board and in countries around the world. That recovery means not only investing in creation of jobs and the basic income for the population at large, but also in programs that create those incentives while making sure that we make the transition to clean energy. Because if the airlines go back to burning that amount of fossil fuels, if countries after another continue to build new luxurious airports and runways, well, there won't be planet to redistribute or to burn off those fossil fuels or to travel to in 2030, as the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has repeatedly said. So I am hopeful that the crisis will create an impetus for those movements to integrate with each other more fully and more effectively, because this is a challenge that's put in evidence everything that was wrong about the quote-unquote normal situation that we were living before the pandemic.
This will be my last question, and then I will open the floor to questions. The inequalities created by neoliberalism was there before, but we know that the pandemic also moves in class boundaries. I mean, people are not affected equally by the pandemic. The weakest is affected the most everywhere in the world. And there is also criticism that up till now, the liberal democracies and the human rights movement could not be enough to end those inequalities in the world, which also are increasing by the pandemic. Do you think that the human rights movement will get out of this crisis and liberal democracies will get out of this crisis, because the system which creates the inequalities are still there? Will this epidemic be enough to create a new system so that the human rights, respect to human rights and human dignity can prevail?
I think and I hope that a different form of democracy will emerge from this crisis, that instead of the illiberal democracy of the regimes that we've been discussing today, we will have a deeper democracy, one that gives more space for citizen participation, but free and frequent citizen participation, not just in elections, not just in moments in which governments can tweak the rules of the game and use the electoral rules of the game to re-elect themselves, which is what many democracies have come to be. But mechanisms like citizen assemblies, which I think is a very promising development. Citizen assemblies have been called in places like Ireland, more recently in France, to discuss key complex policy issues like what to do about climate change. So that more mobilized version of democracy, coupled with the protection of human rights and the renewal of the human rights toolbox, so that we human rights researchers and activists create more frequent and deeper alliances and forms of solidarity with other forms of progressive and inclusive politics, all the way from the racial justice movement to the indigenous movement to the women's movement to climate action movement and so on. That convergence through mobilization on the streets and also through institutional action will hopefully move the needle in the direction of structural reforms that are crucial, that are needed for those inequalities not to continue to grow. So as you said, Murad, before the pandemic, we were heading in the wrong direction in countries, both in the global south and the global north. And in most countries, if not all of the countries that are led by these authoritarian leaders, inequality had increased dramatically. Many of them came to power promising or framing or branding themselves as economic saviors, as the ones who would go give stability to the economies, only to fail spectacularly at offering and actually securing prosperity for the population. Now we know that, because this is what the pandemic has made so evident and so painfully evident, that basic structures of markets, even markets, not just redistribution, but markets and social protection, were so weak that there was no way for them to respond to the situation of the pandemic. So institutions like and institutional configurations like basic income, public healthcare systems, some sort of workers' training programs, some form of more aggressive tax redistribution. All of those seemed radical just a year ago. Now they seem essential, because otherwise we now see how exposed we all are, but definitely how the most vulnerable sectors of the population are to any disruption in markets or the economy in general.
Well, thank you very much, because you, with your approach, you not only keep up hope, which is an essential thing for all the people in the world for struggling for human rights and democracy, but you also show us the new ways to keep that hope to have an impact for the better. So now I'm opening the floor to questions. I'll be receiving them in written form, and ask that. We already have one, and it's about the international humanitarian law. Can that international mechanism be binding for the authoritarian or autocratic leaders in the world? Is it possible? Is it not a risk stepping down from the position with the fear that they can be prosecuted by international humanitarian law?
Yes. The short answer is yes, they are bound by international humanitarian law. There are all kinds of legal tools, rules, and traditions that would show that even if the country has not ratified, say, the treaties, the Rome Statute, and all the international architecture, that some of those actions that they have perpetrated go against basic rules of customary law and constitute crimes against humanity. So there are a couple of, for example, relatively recent efforts to hold both Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and Jair Bolsonaro, extreme opposites in terms of ideology, but very close in terms of anti-democratic politics and persecution of civil society, accountable for human rights, for crimes against humanity. So yes, the short legal answer is definitely yes, but the geopolitical answer is that, of course, with the world being in the state that it is, even before the pandemic, with very few champions of international human rights being willing to step up at the level of the UN Council, at the level of the defense of the ICC, International Criminal Court, the international political support that human rights institutions and humanitarian law have always depended on has become a lot more precarious. So there needs to be, we certainly are not in the 1990s anymore in those terms. This is not a moment of the expansion of the rules of international law, which doesn't mean that it's a moment of crisis, but it also means that we need to invest in political action, not in partisan action, but political action in terms of contesting the narratives, contesting the strategies that those governments have very effectively put into place. Like, for instance, the new legislation in India against the Muslim population that has been powerfully and courageously opposed by students who are now being persecuted for having gone to the streets, protests against those measures in early 2020, early this year. And only through that political mobilization, coupled with the tools that we know how to use, which is mobilize the courts, use the law, invoke international standards, will it be possible to hopefully go back to a time in which those standards will be seen as the international consensus that most, if not all governments will abide by.
We have mentioned Privea from Venezuela as taking new measures against this closing civil space. Do you have other examples so that the audience can look up for the activities of those organizations in mind?
Yes. So again, for those of you interested in looking at very specific examples of creative responses, my recommendation is to go to openglobalrights.org, because there's a wealth of case studies, practical guides on hope-based communications, on creative narratives written by some of my colleagues at OGR, but also by the activists themselves. So I'll just give you a couple of examples from, but this is kind of a very quick and dirty sample. I could use many other instances. So I already mentioned the use of humor. One other way in which some human rights organizations are trying to counter the repressive measures is by changing their organizational structures, right? The one thing that is beautiful about technology of course has its downside, but these days it's more feasible to work in a decentralized way around the world, right? So authoritarian governments try to crack down on physically immobile organizations, say by making it difficult to receive funds from foreign democratic governments or from foundations or from donors or for individuals who want to support their work. Now, those authoritarian governments do not have jurisdiction over what happens elsewhere. So more and more, and I think that this trend is going to increase with the pandemic, organizations are becoming what experts call decentralized or distributed organizations. This was pioneered, just like Russia and the Russian government pioneered many of the anti-civil society measures. Russian activists pioneered some of these countermeasures, which is to try to avoid those restrictions by operating more fluidly in different parts of the world, right? Setting up offices elsewhere or working with individuals as opposed to organizations through offices in other parts of the world. Now with the pandemic and everyone working remotely, I think that this is going to be more and more common. And then a second example has to do with modes of funding. So my previous example was about modes of organization. This one is about funding. human rights organizations have been relatively vulnerable to restrictions to foreign funding because there used to be only a few funding sources of funding in many countries, right? Mostly foreign funders in the global north. Many organizations are becoming more citizen-driven, more volunteer-driven. So, for example, Amnesty International, the largest human rights organization, over the last few months has been quite successful at increasing its membership around the world. And the members around the world contribute a small amount of money. It could be $1 or less, right? But if you have hundreds of thousands of those members, you get two things at the same time. One is you actually mobilize the population because it's not about the money, or just about the money. It is mostly about engaging, reaching out to a broader constituency. So becoming a movement organization as opposed to a kind of a brick and mortar office based organization is also a way that some human rights entities have innovated in response to initially to illiberal democracy and more recently to COVID. So just like anti-rights networks have become quite fluid and mobilized online, rights defending organizations need to be more imaginative about their structures and their ways of operating.
There is one remark about using humor, but I will tell you about it, but ask something else too. Since these populist leaders claim anti-elitism, doesn't using humor feed their rhetoric of anti-elitism, giving them grounds to say that these intellectuals only know how to make fun of real people? So this is a remark, but let me ask the question. As other places in the world, civil society activities, as well as cultural and artistic activities, which address sociopolitical issues which were already vulnerable, were impacted by the pandemic. Many of us anticipate that the government might take this as an advantage and continue its surveillance, limiting mechanisms over those activities. How can we tackle with this problem? Meaning, what measures
That's a great question.
for the pandemic? Yeah.
That's a great question. It's one that's hard to answer because it is true, and I'm glad that someone raised this question because when I speak of civil society organizations, I'm not speaking only of human rights organizations by any means, because as you all painfully know, autocrats tend to go after any dissident voice, be them artists, academics, journalists, and so on. So instead of answer, I would not have a good answer in terms of how to protect people who practice the arts from the persecution. My only unhelpful answer is that they would probably, in the most repressive regimes, will be targeted anyway if they're being active or they're being participating even in street protests. As we know, one of the most draconian measures, the type of measures that these governments take, is go after the protesters on the street. Either and the cause is really could be anything. Could be the defense of a park in the middle of a city, or it could be the defense of a piece of legislation that the government is putting in place because it, for example, violates the rights of minorities, as in India recently. So the way in which I have seen this being tackled creatively is, again, through fluid organizational forms. in ways in which it's not just the artists, it's not just the human rights lawyers, it's not just the journalists taking all the heat, but cross-cutting alliances of citizens, and I'm sure that you all have participated in many of these, that also cut across class, because as Murat said, it's very easy for these leaders to call names and to accuse the opposition of being what in some places in Latin America are called caviar intellectuals, like the people who are talkers and do not suffer like the real people. But if those alliances are cross-class, which is, I think, is starting to happen more clearly under COVID, because the labor movement and also movements of oppressed racial and ethnic minorities are coming out more forcefully to the street and creating alliances across classes, that more diverse, more inclusive progressive front will be harder to stigmatize and to counter by authoritarian leaders.
Okay, let me ask a last question, because we have exceeded an hour, and I don't want to take your time more than that. Since the measures taken against the opposition and the people in general are similar, similar with all the autocratic leaders? Because when Putin takes a new measure against civil society, I personally fear a lot that these measures will be adopted here in Turkey too, and some of them have been. Some of them are similar. Do you think that there is a guidebook for these authoritarian leaders about these measures?
Mm-hmm. Well, there may be a real guidebook, but if there isn't, there certainly is a figurative guidebook. And in the book that you mentioned, we try to come up with a list of items that is usually included in those textbooks for authoritarians. And so I'll give you a quick example. So if you wanted, I once wrote an op-ed called a script for a new authoritarian, or a guidebook for a new authoritarian, right? So this would be, and this would be the list, right, of recommendations for that authoritarian that they tend to give each other. And in a moment, I will explain that this is not just fiction. This something along these lines actually happens. But let me just, for pedagogical purposes, come up with a simple list, a checklist of measures that any authoritarian like this one would be advised to take. First, make it very difficult to register any new NGOs or to run any existing NGO through administrative restrictions, sometimes euphemistically called accountability measures or transparency measures. Second, make it very difficult for independent voices to get support from international funders and international governments. For example, by making that type of support the basis of accusations of foreign espionage or complicity with foreign agents. Again, Russia partly invented that part of the textbook. It's been deployed elsewhere. Egypt, Bolsonaro tried in the first week of his government, and so on. Third, use relentless us versus them narratives. So invest heavily in propaganda that is highly divisive and stigmatize anyone who opposes you as member of the other camp, as the them, and call them non-patriots, non-Indian, non-Turkish, non-Brazilians, and so on. Fourth, try to survive your first term in office and get re-elected. And then after re-election, undermine the electoral rules of the game that got you elected. Because you will need to be re-elected again over and over and over again, Russia and many other places. Look at Maduro, how long he's been around, so the only way that they can live in this world is by perpetuating themselves, not as a movement, not even as a movement, but as individuals. So that sooner or later they will become undemocratic. So they may begin as illiberal Democrats, but they will, as you know, as the law of gravity, will have to become full-blown authoritarians because they will rig the rules of the electoral game to get re-elected. And finally, and this list is longer, but I just give you a quick taste of it. At the international level, come together with similarly minded and situated governments. So just as it is crucial for human rights organizations and journalists, independent journalistic outlets in different regions and countries to come together in defense of democracy, in defense of freedom of expression and so on, the authoritarians of the world have established informal clubs. So just give you an example so that this has some sociological bite to it. If you look at the lineup of presidents who attended the inauguration of President Bolsonaro in Brazil a couple of years ago, you would have found Viktor Orban or Netanyahu, or people who no one in the general population of Brazil would have recognized from the face. It wasn't, if Trump would have shown up, they would have recognized him. But it was these people from Hungary, from Israel, showing up. And what were they doing there? Showing solidarity and making sure that a new powerful member of the club would be welcome. And informally or formally, there is advice going on. There are cooperation going on. And of course, as we know, sadly, for example, the government of Venezuela manages to stay afloat barely through the support of authoritarian governments from China to Russia. And so this cross-learning and mutual support is crucial to that structure, and that's what also it has allowed it to survive for longer than any of us would have hoped.
Cesar, it has been a great pleasure meeting with you again, even it's online, and I would like to thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience on these issues. Thank you very much. Ve Türkiye'den katılanlara da katılıp dinlediğiniz ve soru yönelttiğiniz için çok teşekkür ederim. Bir sonraki panelde görüşmek üzere. I hope we'll meet again in the next panels in the near future. Bye bye.